1919 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Air Corps in June of 1943 at Tuskegee Army Airfield. As you know, the Army, like much of our society, was segregated at that time. The Tuskegee Airmen had an outstanding record in World War II. And we're glad that General McGee is here with us today, and our president, Mr. Eric Eaton, will be interviewing him, but first there'll be a film. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And before we get to kind of the Q&A and reflections part of our presentation today, for those that may not have a lot of familiarity with the Tuskegee Airmen and this specifically, General McGee, we were able to put together a brief video to give you some background on not only their accomplishments, but General McGee and what they meant not only to the effort of the United States defeating the Luftwaffe and winning the Second World War, but the groundwork they served for the change in American history that came subsequently thereafter. So you can keep it right over your shoulder.
They were told they were racially inferior. They were told they lacked the intelligence to handle modern fighter aircraft.
Eric.
They were not supposed to succeed.
The microphone. Volumes.
But in the face of bigotry and ignorance, the Tuskegee Airmen prevailed. With skill and bravery, this all-black fighter squadron shattered racist stereotypes. And their exploits became the stuff of legend. Now you're in the cockpit as red-tailed Mustangs take on swarms of Nazi fighters. Experience the battle. Dissect the tactics. Relive the dogfights of the Tuskegee Airmen. Under pressure from the black press, the NAACP, and even his own wife, President Roosevelt relented in 1939 and ordered the civilian pilot training program to be open to black students who wished to become civilian pilots. In December of 1940, the War Department followed suit and appropriated $1 million to build a suitable base to train black airmen at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. They called the effort to train these men an experiment. The men bonded immediately, imbued with a sense of common purpose and racial pride.
Although the Army didn't believe in our capability, they didn't change the training standards, and that was a plus for us, that we were able to meet the standards and perform successfully.
And World War II gave us a chance to go into combat units and do a first-class job so the larger population would realize how silly and stupid segregation was.
In April of 1943, the first full squadron of African-American fighter pilots, the 99th Fighter Squadron, received orders for deployment to the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. By June of 1944, the 99th had joined 3 other all-black fighter squadrons. Together, they comprised the 332nd Fighter Group, known to history as the Tuskegee Airmen. August 24th, 1944. American B-24 and B-17 bombers of the 5th Bomb Wing approached their target, Pardubice Airfield in Czechoslovakia. Escorting them are 52 red-tailed Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. Among them is Lieutenant Charles McGee, flying a P-51C nicknamed Kitten after his wife. McGee leads a flight of 4.
We were out to the side and slightly above the bombers. Our squadron was on that day operating, as I say, out to the side, weaving back and forth sufficient to be able to look around at all angles, not just flying a straight line.
McGee will soon square off against a battle-hardened foe. Over a German airfield set ablaze by American bombs, McGee will find himself in the fight of his life, a fierce encounter against a tenacious enemy that will test his combat prowess as never before. August 24, 1944. Lieutenant Charles McGee of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flies escort for American heavy bombers. Their target is a German airfield in Pardubice, Czechoslovakia. McGee and the rest of the 332nd have battled hatred and ignorance for the privilege of flying combat. Each mission is a chance to prove their worth to a bigoted military hierarchy. As Pardubice comes into view on the horizon, McGee searches for the enemy.
Attacking a aerodrome like that is a great way to scare up some enemy opposition. That's what happened.
McGee's squadron commander calls out 2 FW-190s at 4 o'clock high.
My flight was dispatched to go after them. They were actually attempting to dive into the bomber stream.
McGee and his flight turn to engage the 190s. They're about to go toe-to-toe with Nazi Germany's most advanced single-engine fighter. The Focke-Wulf 190 is a tough and agile opponent, heavily armed with 2 13mm machine guns and 4 20mm cannons. McGee flies an early model P-51 Mustang, the P-51C. Even though it lacks the refinements of later Mustang models, it is still a formidable fighter aircraft. With a top speed of 440 miles per hour and armament consisting of 4 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. McGee's P-51C is faster and more maneuverable, but the FW-190 is more rugged and has better armament. The 190s are here. McGee and his men are here. McGee's best option is a slicing right turn that will position him directly on his opponent's tail.
I took off after the plane to try to get a position to fire on him, and the plane continued in and dived.
The Mustangs close with the enemy. But as soon as the 190s spot the danger, they split up. McGee takes his wingman, Roger Romine, with him after one of the fleeing Germans. The desperate German pilot fights for his life, rolling, diving, jinking, anything to shake the Mustang.
The enemy aircraft went for the deck as fast as it could and started engaging in a series of evasive maneuvers, trying to get Charles into a scissors battle, going back and forth and trying to shake him that way.
They're doing a little turning, we call it jinking around, to get us either to overrun them or lose us. I was able to control speed enough to stay, but trying to close to a firing range, because you're just wasting ammunition if you try to fire too soon.
McGee exploits the P-51's speed advantage and closes on his enemy. But the dogfight is getting dangerously close to Pardubice.
The German pilot dove towards the airfield and led McGee across the airfield, which was by this point burning from the bombing raid. And again, the idea was for the German pilot not to engage McGee in some air-to-air combat, but to drag him across an area where the German flak could open fire and perhaps take out the American fighter on his tail.
I can remember over the aerodrome, I could see one of the hangars on fire and some planes on the field.
Flak bursts all around him. The anti-aircraft gunners are zeroing in. McGee will soon be forced to break off. But suddenly, the German makes a critical mistake.
He made the fatal turn going around to the right, which appeared to me he might have been trying to escape through some of the smoke and saw it was coming from the field, but it was the wrong turn because I had to be right in the right position at that time to effectively fire on it.
McGee opens fire. His 450 cals make quick work of the German. The 190 shudders sickeningly, then rolls. The wounded Focke-Wulf hits the ground in a brilliant explosion.
That was my first victory, and of course, right then, your adrenaline is pumping pretty well, and like I say, you know there's fire from the ground, and so the idea was to not fly a straight path, but keep moving, but flying away at low altitude to get away from the guns that were around the airport.
Romine, who had been separated from McGee through the chase, rejoins his flight lead. The victorious Mustang pilots return to their position in the bomber stream.
Actually, we were very damn good in our escort. And later we got the Presidential Unit Citation. The guys were really, really so happy.
By war's end, the 332nd had downed 108 enemy aircraft, received 744 air medals, 150 distinguished flying crosses, 14 bronze stars, and 1 silver star. But despite the accolades for their efforts overseas, the Tuskegee Airmen returned to a segregated America, indifferent to their achievements.
I'm coming down the gangplank from a boat that brought me back to the States. And at the bottom of the gangplank was a sign that said colored troops to the right, white troops to the left, separated again. And at that time I said, well, you know, this is a pity.
But the war efforts of the Tuskegee Airmen would not be forgotten.
Our experience dispelled the myths and biases that have been part of Army policy on our capability and how we would be used, so it brought about a change.
In 1948, by order of President Harry Truman, the armed forces of the United States were integrated. The war record of the Tuskegee Airmen in the skies of Europe had shaken the foundations of entrenched American racism. This small but resolute group of African-American men, refined by hardship, danger, and adversity, had proven the fundamental injustice of a segregated military.
You've got to know inside that racism is wrong. You've got to know inside that you have the capacity of anybody else. And when given the opportunity, you will overcome.
We'd accomplished something important once given the opportunity. and the importance that this shows that it's not happenstance of birth or color of skin. It's important. It's really what Martin Luther King really gave our country, content and character.
You said it was well done. You guys can really fly. I have one question for you before I get to the rest. What made you follow that German back over the airfield that you had to know everybody would shoot at you?
Well, the actual circumstance was I was avoiding the draft. I was in college, ROTC, Pershing rifle, learning to handle rifle, but because I was in school, the draft board wasn't pulling my number. Occasionally they had they, to me, that was been on the ground with the rifle in the mud. And I heard about the flying opportunity, and I really think probably my ROTC instructor said, no, apply for the pilot, because what I heard about was the ground training. Because of Army policy, well, you have to kind of put a couple things together. There was a civilian pilot training program that started in 1939 to provide approval pilots for our military to draw on as they build up their units. Because of Army policy, in fact, a graduate from Howard University here in DC from the civilian pilot training program went next door and said, I want to be an Army pilot. I said, we have no black mechanics, we can't use a black pilot. So of the now called Tuskegee Airmen, the first war mechanics trained at Chanute Field, ran to Illinois at the technical school, expected to fail, because the Army said, well, we've studied the policy, we know it's going to fail. They didn't. In fact, one of the things in their training, they took exams. One of the in the leadership couldn't believe their scores and had them tested again, still came out tops. So the pilots were graduating, and that's when the Army said, my gosh, we need an airfield for pilot training. Airfields all around the country. But they found the money, as you saw in the film, to build a separate airfield for the program. So mechanics trained at Chanute went south first to Maxwell while they built Tuskegee Army Airfield. Then their pilot training began in 41. And as I say, the first group of now called Tuskegee Army were 99 Pursuit Squadron, later Fighter Squadron. Expected to fail, they did, but I now say there are 5 phases to the Tuskegee experience that we've had to go through all of them. But the story of the 99 Pursuit Squadron is the first phase.
Very good. Did I hear you say you were attending school at Howard University in ROTC at the time?
No, one of the graduates in that school.
Okay.
I was at the University of Illinois.
Okay.
And as I say, but all I can say is, yes, I was avoiding the draft, but after my first flight, I was hooked. For me to be able to get in the air and loop, roll, and spin, and come back and put your feet on the ground, couldn't ask for anything better.
So in that context, as you got to actually to one of my questions, I've seen you in this particular film many times, and one of the things I was curious about, if you hadn't gone to flight training, what would you have done? Because in these clips, you sound like a professor of engineering giving a lecture, as opposed to a fighter pilot. So what was early life like for you? And had it not been for the war and pilot training, what would you have been doing?
I may have ended up continuing my education. I got called into training with 2 years of college. Had I graduated, I'd probably be doing some kind of engineering, I'm not sure what. At the time, because you kind of took a track, but there were several options available, and I hadn't gotten to the point of selecting which option I was going to follow. But I, entering the service, I kept getting assignments that were paying off because I was still flying. It didn't stop me from flying. And so I'm a happy camper. You know? Don't try to change something that's good. And all I can say is now, why me, how, I have no idea. But I kept getting wonderful assignments and actively flew 27 of my 30 years of service.
You just happen to be that guy in the right place at the right time.
The right place, the right time, and getting called, we need you here, go there, do this. One of the things they did, and I don't know, the full background of this begins from a 1925 Army War College study that the subject was use of Negro manpower if America gets involved in another war. Paragraph 3 of the study, the Negro is physically qualified. The Negro is mentally inferior to the white man. The Negro is morally inferior to the white man, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, not qualified to do anything technical like maintain and fly an aircraft. Oh, we could dig ditches, cook food, drive trucks, build roads, but do anything. That's all on page 1. On page 2, we're second-class citizens. So that was sent to Washington to be a part of mobilization policy if the country ever got involved in the war. Well, now you know the story. Country coming out of 10 years of depression, war declared, didn't change segregation, but provided opportunity for people to support the war buildup, for enlistments and so on. And as to support our allies in Europe, the need continued to grow, pressures on. That's when President finally said, the issue's been studied, we're going to be successful. We'll authorize the 99th Pursuit Squadron. At that time, squadron, 34 pilots, 24 aircraft, for maintaining the aircraft and all the skills necessary, a couple hundred mechanics. But for segregation, which the Army insisted on, oh, we need medical, communication, supply, administration, and other skills. That's another couple hundred. These people were trained and brought together at Tuskegee Airfield, and the pilot training began in 41, December 42, 99th ready for combat. No white commander wanted to fly. They continued in training for another 4 months, and the Army finally decided to send them to North Africa, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group. But segregation went overseas. They went to their own base. They sent a pilot over to the 33rd, got the briefing, came back through the mission. But Colonel Mulmeyer, not wanting them, after a few months, said, told you they're not aggressive. They only shot down one aircraft, should be patrolling Liberia. You remember where Liberia is on the map? The Germans in North Africa. Well, I think you understand. Get out of my hair. Well, that brought a hearing in Washington. Now that hearing, their study, 99 bombs on target was equal to the other squadrons. Only been in combat a short time. War still going on. Stayed combat. The 99th moved out of North Africa into Sicily, out of Sicily into Italy. And looking back on that history, I would say there's one little bit of integration, because when they moved into Italy, they were assigned to the 79th Fighter Group. Colonel Bates was just glad to have more aircraft, more pilots to do the job. Over the Anzio beachhead, 99th pilots shot down over a several-day time frame. I'm not, wave your hand or wave the flag if they don't. 99 pilots shot down 17 German aircraft, so it was a matter of opportunity. It happens, they're going to need replacements, and training continued at Tuskegee Army Airfield. 3 additional single-engine fighter squadrons were formed, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. I was assigned to the 302nd Squadron. We're combat ready in the P-40, which the 99's flying. And they said, well, you are going to do some patrol work. They switched us to the P-39 Bel Air Cobra, but we still left training on time, December 43, heading to combat, and we, the 332nd Fighter Group, moved into Italy at the same time 99th was moving out of Sicily into Italy. But we were at Naples Harbor. We patrolled Naples Harbor and the waterways to the Anzio beachhead during that time frame. But this, the 332nd Fighter Group was what I would then call the second phase of the now called Tuskegee experience. It happens, we thought we had enough guns on our B-17s and B-24s to protect our forces in the raid to destroy Germany's war-making potential. It wasn't happening. Lost one of the bombers, 10 American lives. So 15th Air Force there in Italy, 8th and 9th Air Force, if you have history of England, 12th and 15th Air Force, Italy, Mediterranean Theater. But they picked 4 groups from 12th Tactical Air Force to move to 15th Strategic Air Force. When we moved from Naples area to the Adriatic side of Italy, our bombers now out of North Africa are in southern Italy, but they needed the escort. Of the 4 groups, 332nd Fighter Group was one of them. And we began the escort work. P-39 wasn't the aircraft. Combat, we switched to the P-47 Thunderbolt. And back, and I say that because back then you didn't have time to go to school and so on. Mechanics got their hands greasy and the pilots just read tech order and sat in the aircraft. In fact, I said, if the mechanic can start it, I can fly it. But we started the escort work, and I'll add here because something, they called us the Red Tails, right? Anybody know why? Somebody, you know why?
So it was because it was deliberately painting a bright colored bullseye on the tails to draw away the German fighters who were, to keep them from going after the bombers.
Well, not so much to draw away the German, but it was to let the gunners on the bombers to know that these planes suddenly showing up are friendly, not German. Of the 4 groups, one had a yellow tail, one had candy stripe, red and white, one had orange and black checkerboard, 332nd, the red tail. That's how that really came about, and certainly what was an important factor. But the red tails is stuck. But as I talk about the Tuskegee experience, and you've got quite a bit of what happened there out of the film. When I graduated in June of '43, our white instructor said, too bad they don't have a bomber program for you guys, because I think you'd make a good bomber pilot. I wouldn't ask him what he meant by that, but he didn't know, nor did I, that they had already approved medium bomber training in Tuskegee, and 3 months later, Mitchell B-25, 477th Bomb Group medium, 4 squadrons, again, all of their necessary support. So you talk about the red tails a lot now, but remember that's just half of the experience and half the squadron. So, but the 477th, although they didn't get into combat, played a very important part of the history, because I believe it was the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper once published a story to say, oh, we're also fighting for 2 victories. Victory against victory against German in Europe, victory against racism here at home in training. And the 477th Bomb Group played an important part of that. They're the 3rd phase of the experience. But now, what happened? Army regulations had been passed saying there should be no segregation then just on race, creed, and color. We've added a few other attachments to to that sense. But Colonel Selway had General Hunter's okay to say on his base he wanted to maintain segregation. Trainees can only use the facilities I designate. He didn't want black officers going to the white officers club. Knowing, and back then, your club dues were taken out of your pay before you got the money. Officers knew this and peacefully tried to enter the white club in 2s and 3s, were denied. Colonel Selway, upset, called them in and said, I'd like you to reread my regulation and sign this piece of paper that you'll abide. 101 refused because they knew what Army regulations provided. They were immediately shipped from Seymour, Indiana to Godman Field, Kentucky, behind barbed wire guards, all of this. Washington hearing, worse treatment than German prisoners of war at the adjacent Fort Knox. But out of that hearing, I don't know where they sent Selway, they knew he was wrong. But the Army had a problem. Oh, they didn't change segregation. They just said, we'll have a composite group, 477 composite group, keep 2 of the B-25 squadrons. This is now 45 time frame, the war is over, and we'll reactivate the 9 mines. This composite group, that's too large a deal for Godman Field. But we'll open up Lockburn Air Base, now Rickenbacker, for those of you who know the history, south of Columbus, Ohio. 477 composite group moved to Ohio. What happened 46 when training ended across the country? All of us lived there. Lockburn Air Base, south of Columbus, Ohio. Folks, the Army never changed the policy. War's over in 45. 1947, our United States Air Force became a separate service, separating from the ground element. There was some still believing in segregation, but there were enough who said, you know, we need to use people based on training, experience, and where needed, not their accidental birth, if you will. And we're not getting enough money to keep Lockburn open, but not able to assign because of segregation to meet our needs. We need to integrate. A few months later, they were backed by a very courageous president, Harry Truman, the president that said, "Above stops here." He issued an executive order, 9981, mandating all of the services need to integrate. Well, that's a statement. Action takes a little time. The Air Force closed Lockburn Air Base 1st of July, 1949, and we were scattered around the world. Another interesting part of that history, and I mentioned that composite group was the 4th phase of the Tuskegee experience. Apparently, I think we were attached to the Tactical Air Command. They didn't want B-25s. I don't know what they did with it. But at Lockburn, 332nd Fighter Group was reactivated, flying P-47Ms. And as I don't know what they did with B-25s, but part of the history before the Air Force acted on their intentions, 1st of May, or early May 1949. How many have heard of Top Guns? What Top Guns is? That was the Air Force's first Top Gun meeting. Can you guess who the Top Guns were? History won't tell you, because when the Air Force began their history a number of years later, the historians wrote down first Top Guns unknown. Guess who they were? Pilots, 332nd Fighter Group flying P-47Ms were the first Top Guns of the United States Air Force in the reciprocating engine phase. Of course, jets were becoming available, but they did not compete against each other. Well, it took the Air Force a little time to catch up with history, with research. I think it was well into the 90s before the Top Gun trophy was found in the basement of the Air Force Museum. So found a more proper place when you look at history. I don't mind repeating where history has been, because young folks need to understand where we've come from, but have a better picture of where we need to be going. And we as mentors of them, and that's a responsibility I hope each and every one of you have. If there's youngsters out there reading, don't overlook it. Whether it's in family, neighbor, but I tell the folks now, if it's good for family, that's good for a community. What's good for making community is good for the state, and what's good for the state is good for the country. So what better place to start? We should all find, there's a youngster out there needing you. You don't know it, but find them. And learn, because it's so important to the future of our country. We're more diverse now than we were then, but we haven't learned to all get together on that basis. So the experience of the Tuskegee Airmen dispelled the biases, generalizations, in some cases like racist thoughts, that because we were black, we were second class, incapable of study and so on. But again, folks don't look at history. There was a black working with Thomas Edison. There was a black working the first person to go to the North Pole. What's your history? What's your family history? But the key is, what does that mean us in our actions today, and how we treat each other, and how we mentor the young people who are our country's future. But I think I've said enough, but I think there's some questions.
I don't know if you quite said it. You did say an awful lot. You brought this completely in a full circle in many ways, and thank you very much. It was very concise and to the point, and as you pointed out, and I think sadly I would have to say, the work that you all started unfortunately still needs work to be done today. And we take your words to heart and make sure we continue that work. And to your point, I'm sure there are a number of people who would like to ask you some questions.
Yes, General McGee, I'd like to ask you about your commander, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. And he was a West Point graduate, but forced to have no roommate for 4 years, but he persevered and kind of being isolated, but he graduated. What was he like as a commander?
We had great respect for B.O. Davis. When he graduated in '36 from West Point, he said, "I'd like to fly." And of course, the Army said, "We have no black units," so he was denied the opportunity. He went through the training when he started in '41 as a captain. His classmates were all lieutenant colonels, so they bumped him up to lieutenant colonel, but he graduated with the first class. There were 12 students, 4 of the cadets and he as a captain were the first graduates at Tuskegee Army Airfield, the first pilots of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. He had great respect for him. Certainly, once learning what he went through to get his commission, but to be our leadership, he was a person we respected, and he let us second first lieutenants know what the job was. And that's really what was successful, because I mentioned earlier that of the 4 groups picked to begin the escort work, but the task was save American lives. Now I'd say this because I mentioned we were with 15th Air Force in Italy, 8th Air Force out of England had a different, they said, task is destroy German Air Force. What does that mean? 332nd Fighter Group, some of them have already heard that finally B.O. Davis put on his plane by request. The bomb groups that didn't know the Red Tails were black pilots, but if they could get the Red Tails as their escort, they asked for it. But why? B.O. let us know, let's say, we rise second first lieutenant's like to get a victory, because 5 victories, oh, you're an ace. But that often meant leaving the bombers because somebody was out there. If you mentioned in the film, they did it right. It wasn't until the bombers actually tried to penetrate the stream we were escorting was I and compatriots dispatched to fight them off. If we weren't attacked, we stuck with the bombers, and that was B.O.'s leadership. He actually said, I'll court-martial a pilot that goes happy hunting. We all want to be an ace and be recognized that way. But that was the difference in our effort and purpose, following his leadership that said, we stick with the bombers. We fight off any German attack. We didn't leave the bombers to go get a victory, because that meant somebody else up in the sky. As soon as you left, they come in. What does that mean? Bombers lost. So with his leadership, that again we certainly respected and lived high, and we talked about what took place. But that happened even in the training. In the early training at Tuskegee, there were some folks that weren't there to ensure success. Fortunately, early commander was changed, and the gentleman assigned believed in the opportunity. He didn't change segregation, couldn't change segregation in Tuskegee. We talk about Tuskegee. Folks, we ought to be talking about Tuskegee Institute, because the town of Tuskegee and the sheriff were not friends.
Right.
Period. We didn't stop in Tuskegee. Working around Tuskegee Institute. Our country's come a long way, folks. And that's why I emphasize that, you know, folks think when we say Tuskegee, Alabama, that the city of Tuskegee was supportive. Unfortunately, they weren't. But again, in time, look at the change. They even had point of pattern in black memory. That didn't exist back in those early years. Some of this, sometimes it's not good to talk about, but yet it's important that our young folks understand where we've come from and where we still need to go when you look at what's going on in the country and around. And I won't say what type of leadership we need.
Okay. More questions, I can bury the microphone, and so, one in the back, and then we'll go over there.
General, the segregated black infantry divisions often had a very high number of white officers from the command level down. I was just wondering, what was it like in the aviation section with the ability of black officers to go up the chain of command, not only the pilots, but the technical, like the intelligence or the medical, your support units. Where was the where was the dividing line, and did it improve during the war?
That's an interesting question, because that day there wasn't much movement up the ladder. In fact, today, and certainly I've been honored to have an honorary promotion to Brigadier General. A recent retiree, Lieutenant Colonel of the Air Force, wrote a book entitled "The Air Force's Black Ceiling." There was no ladder going up in that day. Even after integration, we got better assignments overseas than here at home for many years. And the only way I can give you an example of that, the airfield in Ohio, closed in 49, was a wing base operation with B.O. Davis as a commander. next such assignment in the country, I became commander of Richards Guevara Air Base in 1840th Air Base Wing in 1972. So from 49 to 72, there wasn't no ladder. If there was a ladder there, it'd be there it runs. And so on. So that's been a gradual change. B.O. didn't get it, his 4-star until retirement. Should have had it long before. I would have loved to have been Brigadier General in active duty service. I loved working with people, had wonderful assignments. And like I said, we got assignments overseas, we didn't get home. I commanded the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron in the Philippines for 2 years. Came home, staff school, and so on, and so on. I was first deputy and then commander of a support squadron during the Cold War, Jupiter missile deployment. I was commander of 16th Attack Recon Squadron in Vietnam. So it was possible, but it was not part of the Air Force ladder, if you will. So I say that soon you see a picture. What happened to women? You know, I still say we were treated better than the women Air Force service pilots. Because we at least were commissioned and allowed to serve. They served our country for 2 years and had to pay their own way home, bury their own dead and whatever. Folks, there's so much like that takes place in our country, and we shouldn't forget it. And we should always be fighting for changing it if it appears. I think that, well, see, first there was somebody back there and then you.
Who's next? Okay.
General, you mentioned that when the order came down for integration in the armed services, it was one thing to be said from the top, but it actually took a little while for things to roll out. Was the general attitude, resigned acceptance? Was there a lot of active resistance? Was it more passive? I was just curious if you could tell me a little bit about your experiences in that transition phase. Thank you.
Well, that's interesting, and I partially don't have experience to answer the question. I mentioned being overseas during the Cold War. Those were the years of the fight here at home for integration in restaurants and hotels, and so on, part of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, my service overseas, I missed that here at home. But again, it was an important step. So again, there was no clear path. There was a lot of people still against it. And unfortunately, some out there today still not happy. But we hope their eyes get opened and their hearts change somewhere along the way. So that's there's no straight road, if you will, to answer that question. So.
Okay. Thank you.
General, thank you for everything you've done for all the years. Let me turn to the other side. What was German propaganda saying about you guys?
That's an interesting question to me for two reasons. First, let me say we had several of our pilots' planes shot down, became prisoners of war. Folks, German intelligence was way ahead of where we are. We had prisoners of war interrogator tell them where they went to school, when they graduated, when they joined the service. That took place here in our country for them to find out those types of things. But even though we were fighting, Germany did believe in the Geneva Conventions. Our prisoners of war were treated appropriately. Vietnam is another story. But the Germans did believe in the convention, and we have no stories of any black pilot being mistreated or treated separately from everybody else that was in a camp. Certainly that's interesting when you also look at the German attitude against the Jewish population at the time.
Okay. One question over here.
General McGee, thank you very much for your service and mentorship. I wanted to ask if you could speak to your later years during the Vietnam era and maybe what airmen and the soldiers that you were still serving with made of the events at the time in the civil rights era, since that was kind of happening at the same time as the Vietnam War.
That's interesting, and I'm not sure I can answer your question in the way I feel you've asked it. Serving in the military was non-political. And so, you know, the oath is to serve the country following the rules from your leadership. And so there was no knowledge and no activity of the political attitude behind what was taking place. But the other side of that, we need to understand. World War I, we declared war, we provided what it took to win the war. Korea, using military power for political purposes. Vietnam, using military power for political purposes. What's going on today? Military power for political purposes. There's no win. Politics is a compromise. So when they talk about winning, all I'd say, it's sad that we have so many lives being lost under those circumstances.
Thank you.
You have a question here?
So, General McGee, you know, leadership, everything rises and falls on that. What would you say are your key to the longevity of your leadership? Because you're clearly still leading us and challenging us. But give us some points on what you think great leaders are made of, or some things that you believe in.
Well, my answer to that question, I've occasionally been asked by youngsters. When I look back, first of all, it's glad to grow up. First thing, you treat other people like you want to be treated. Fighting back then because you were called names and so on, only somebody had a black eye or a bloody nose, but it didn't solve the issue. Treat other people like you want to be treated. Then that started when I was pretty little. Although when we played church, I might have said, let's sing one more song and get out of here. I was able to be sharing the Boy Scouts. Folks, if everybody today lived by the Scout Oath and the 12 Scout Laws, we'd have a different country. But that was a wonderful experience to me. Over and over, I will do my best to what? To God, to country, help other people at all times, keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, morally straight, and then to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, reverent. Got anything better? I don't know of anything, but I was glad to have been a part of it. Then college years, I joined a fraternity that precepts to be first of all, you must be a servant of all.
And we shall transcend all.
And what was that? I mentioned earlier. Just imagine somebody coming along behind. Here I am. So when I look at the assignments received, accolades, this promotion, all I did, why me, how me? I don't have the answer.
but I'm glad to be able to share what I've experienced with our young people, because I give it to them in 4 Ps. Perceive, prepare, perform, persevere. Perceive, dream your dreams, find your talents. And I like to ask, because I found something I'd like to do. Hopefully among your talents is something you'd like to do, because you don't want to go to work every day and not like what you have. But prepare. Get a good education. Learn to read, write, and speak well, and develop those talents that you have. Perform. Always doing your best, never anything less, but with excellence as your goal in everything that you do, not just some, but in everything. Persevere. We could have bowed our heads, said they don't like me, they call me names, don't want me, going off and not serve the country, or ourselves, if you will. Don't let adverse circumstances be your excuse for not achieving. That's what I like to pass on today, and folks, it's helped keep me out of the rocket ship.
Mr. Eaton, I'd just like to announce to everyone, we'll have a reception afterwards in our student lounge down the hallway here, and you're all invited to lunch. And we want to thank General McGee, and I know Mr. Eaton will have some closing remarks. Our president and
Sir, you are an extremely difficult act to follow. I'm not quite sure what I can say, but first, just simply with thank you. And this is thanks across a very broad spectrum, given your service to the country during an era which essentially changed what would become the history of the latter part of the 20th century, as well as taking us into the 21st century. I think your views, your outlooks today are still just as relevant as they were when you did your flight training, got your commission in the 40s, and led through what was an exemplary military career service. So thank you so much for all of that. I will take a little leeway now. When I said before, I knew you were that guy. I knew it was something about the fact you are that guy. And it takes individuals like that to be that guy that will determine a lot of things in life, whether it is through military service, through the governing elements here in the country, service in the classroom, in teaching, and just service in everyday life. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
so, thank you. Yes. So if you follow, yes. So, if people follow,
Hey, oh, you made it. I didn't see you sitting back there. Catch you in a bit.
it's okay.
How are you doing? Good to see you again.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, for sure. I know we have our policy I'm here. So just whenever I'm still familiar with spot to be there. Oh yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep, what?
Once we transition, I've got about 20.
I gotta staff members, I have to get back. I won't be able to.
I'm not interested in taking on 20.
Trent Dudley?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're meeting up later today.
Oh, are you telling him I said hi?